What my sister didn't know when she humiliated me at the family barbecue was that I controlled a billion-dollar defense budget and outranked every officer she'd ever served under. But she was about to find out in the most shocking way possible. The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly on the Wilson family's backyard as retired Marine Colonel David Wilson pulled his weathered 2008 Honda Civic into the gravel driveway. The car's paint had faded to a dull silver, and the passenger door squeaked loudly as he stepped out, straightening his simple khaki pants and plain white polo shirt. To anyone watching, he looked like exactly what he appeared to be, a struggling veteran trying to make ends meet in civilian life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. David had been out of the military for 2 years now, officially retired according to his family. What they didn't know was that his retirement was merely a cover story carefully constructed by the Pentagon to protect one of America's most valuable intelligence assets. At 45, David wasn't just any former Marine, he was General David Wilson, head of the Defense Intelligence Agency's most classified operations, controlling budgets that would make Fortune 500 CEOs weep with envy. But today, like every other family gathering for the past 2 years, he was just Dave the broke veteran to his relatives. The backyard was already buzzing with activity as the Wilson family annual reunion was in full swing. His older sister, Captain Jennifer Wilson Martinez, resplendent in her Army dress uniform, was holding court near the barbecue pit, surrounded by various family members hanging on her every word. At 48, Jennifer commanded a training battalion at Fort Stewart and had never let the family forget her military achievements. Her uniform was perfectly pressed, her ribbons gleaming in the afternoon sun, and her captain's bars caught the light with every animated gesture. And then I told the recruit, Jennifer was saying, her voice carrying across the yard, "You will address me as Captain Wilson Martinez, not ma'am. These bars weren't given to me, I earned every one of them through blood, sweat, and dedication to our great nation." The assembled family members, cousins, aunts, uncles, and their various spouses nodded appreciatively. Jennifer had always been the family's military success story, the one who'd made something of herself in the service. Her husband, Miguel, a civilian contractor, beamed with pride as he filmed her speech on his phone. David grabbed a beer from the cooler and found a quiet spot under the old oak tree, content to observe rather than participate. His nephew, Tommy, Jennifer's 16-year-old son, wandered over with the uncomfortable slouch of a teenager forced to attend family functions. "Hey, Uncle Dave," Tommy said, plopping down on the grass beside him. "Mom's been going on about her promotion again. She's convinced she'll make major next year." David smiled softly. If only Tommy knew that David had personally reviewed and approved Jennifer's promotion packet 3 months ago, not as her brother, but as the general who oversaw military intelligence personnel assignment. The promotion was already guaranteed, but Jennifer would never know her broke brother had been the one to ensure it went through. "Your mom's worked hard for everything she's achieved," David replied diplomatically, taking a sip of his beer. "She deserves recognition for her service." Across the yard, Jennifer had moved on to her favorite topic, criticizing David's life choices. Her voice rose as she gestured toward him with obvious disdain. "I just don't understand how someone can throw away a perfectly good military career," she was saying to their cousin Mark, a successful real estate agent. Dave had potential once, but look at him now. Driving that piece of junk car, wearing Walmart clothes, probably living paycheck to paycheck like most veterans who can't adjust to civilian life. Mark glanced uncomfortably toward David, clearly embarrassed by Jennifer's loud commentary. "Maybe he's just figuring things out." "Figuring things out?" Jennifer scoffed. "He's been figuring things out for 2 years. Meanwhile, I'm commanding 200 soldiers, making real decisions that affect national security. Some people rise to the occasion, and others," she shrugged dismissively, "others just fade away." David felt Tommy tense beside him. The teenager obviously wanted to defend his uncle, but Jennifer's military authority and forceful personality made family members think twice before challenging her. What Jennifer didn't know was that just yesterday, David had been in a secure conference room at the Pentagon, briefing the Secretary of Defense on a covert operation that would save American lives overseas. The Walmart clothes she mocked were specifically chosen to maintain his cover identity. The old Honda Civic was registered to a fake identity and swept for surveillance devices weekly by his security team. His real car, a custom armored BMW, sat in the underground garage of his McLean, Virginia estate, a 12,000-square-foot mansion that he'd paid for in cash, the same estate that housed his private office, where he made decisions that affected global military strategy and controlled budgets exceeding $50 billion annually. But none of that mattered right now. Right now he was just Dave, the family disappointment. Uncle Robert, their father's brother and a Vietnam veteran himself, walked over and sat heavily in a lawn chair near David. At 72, Robert moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp, and David had always suspected the old veteran saw more than he let on. "Don't pay attention to Jenny," Robert said quietly, using Jennifer's childhood nickname. "She always was too big for her britches. Some people measure success by how loud they can announce it." David nodded, appreciating the support. Robert was one of the few family members who never made him feel like a failure. The old veteran had his own demons from Vietnam, and he understood that military service changed people in ways that civilians couldn't always see. "She means well," David replied, though even he wasn't entirely convinced of that. "Success means different things to different people." "Damn right it does," Robert muttered, adjusting his VFW cap. "Real power doesn't need to announce itself." If only Robert knew how true those words were. As the afternoon wore on, David watched his sister continue to dominate conversations, name-dropping military contacts and discussing her important responsibilities with anyone who would listen. She had no idea that several of the colonels she mentioned with such reverence reported directly to David in the chain of command. The classified briefings she hinted at were routine intelligence updates that crossed David's desk every morning. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here was his sister, proud of commanding 200 soldiers, completely unaware that her brother commanded operations involving thousands of personnel across 6 continents. She boasted about her security clearance, while David held clearances so classified that most generals didn't even know they existed. But the cover had to be maintained. Too many lives depended on his anonymity. Too many operations relied on his invisibility. Let Jennifer have her moment in the sun. Soon enough, the truth would have a way of revealing itself. As David finished his beer and prepared to endure another round of family small talk, he had no idea that tomorrow would bring an unexpected visitor to the family reunion, someone who would shatter his carefully maintained cover and turn Jennifer's world completely upside down. The reunion was just getting started, and the real show hadn't even begun yet. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, the Wilson family barbecue was hitting its stride. The smell of grilled burgers and hot dogs mixed with the sound of children playing and adults reminiscing about old times. For most families, this would be a perfect summer evening, but David Wilson could feel the tension building like a storm on the horizon. Jennifer had moved from casual criticism to outright humiliation, and she was just getting warmed up. "You know what really bothers me about Dave's situation?" Jennifer announced loudly enough for half the backyard to hear. She was standing near the picnic table, her army uniform still immaculate despite the Georgia heat, addressing a growing audience of relatives. "It's not just that he's struggling financially, it's that he seems to have given up entirely." Their cousin Sarah, a nurse from Atlanta, shifted uncomfortably. "Jennifer, maybe we shouldn't." "No, I think this needs to be said," Jennifer interrupted, her captain's authority taking full control of the conversation. "Look, I love my brother, but someone in this family needs to have an honest conversation with him about his choices." David remained seated under the oak tree, mechanically peeling the label off his beer bottle. Tommy had wandered off to help their grandfather with the grill, leaving David alone to weather his sister's increasingly public character assassination. Uncle Robert had dozed off in his lawn chair, the old veteran's peaceful snoring a stark contrast to the growing tension. "I mean, let's be realistic here," Jennifer continued, warming to her theme. "Dave served honorably, I'll give him that. But the military isn't just about serving, it's about seizing opportunities for advancement. Look at what I've accomplished in my career. She gestured to her uniform with obvious pride. Battalion Command at 48, on track for promotion to Major, responsible for training the next generation of American warriors. I didn't just serve my country, I climbed the ladder, I made connections, I built something meaningful. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Miguel, Jennifer's husband, nodded supportively while recording more of her speech on his phone. He'd heard variations of this lecture at every family gathering for the past 2 years, but he dutifully played his role as the supportive spouse. Meanwhile, Jennifer's voice took on a more pointed edge. Dave drives around in a car that probably isn't worth what I spend on groceries in a month. Have you seen his clothes? Everything looks like it came from a discount store clearance rack. Actually, David's discount store polo shirt had cost $300 and was made from a specialized fabric that was comfortable, durable, and more importantly, didn't show up clearly on surveillance camera. His cheap khaki pants were custom tailored by the same company that made clothing for Secret Service agents. Every item in his carefully curated broke veteran wardrobe had been selected by Pentagon security specialists. But Jennifer was far from finished with her public dissection of his life choices. And don't even get me started on where he's living, she said, shaking her head dramatically. That little apartment complex on the wrong side of Savannah, you know, the one with the broken fence and the parking lot full of potholes. I drove by there last month when I was visiting. It's exactly the kind of place where veterans end up when they can't figure out how to transition to civilian success. The family members were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with Jennifer's monologue, but none of them seemed willing to challenge her military authority. She had always been the dominant personality in family gatherings, and her recent promotion to battalion commander had only amplified her tendency to lecture others. What Jennifer didn't know was that David's little apartment was actually a carefully maintained safe house, one of 3 residences he used for security purposes. The broken fence and potholed parking lot were deliberate, part of a cover identity that had taken Pentagon intelligence specialists 6 months to perfect. The neighbors thought he was a struggling veteran working part-time at a hardware store. In reality, the hardware store was a front operation that allowed him to maintain contact with his handlers without raising suspicion. His real home, the McLean Mansion, was registered under a maze of shell companies and trust funds. The property included a state-of-the-art security system, a secure communications center, and a garage housing, not just the armored BMW, but also a collection of vehicles that would make most Hollywood action heroes jealous. I just think it's sad, Jennifer continued, her voice taking on a tone of mock sympathy. Here's someone who had every opportunity to succeed, who served his country with distinction, and now he's just existing. No ambition, no drive, no vision for the future. Their Aunt Margaret, a retired teacher who had always been fond of David, finally spoke up. Jennifer, dear, maybe David is happy with his life choices. Not everyone needs to climb the corporate ladder to find fulfillment. Jennifer's laugh was sharp and dismissive. Aunt Margaret, look at him over there. Does that look like happiness to you? That's resignation. That's what happens when someone gives up on themselves. David glanced up to find several family members looking at him with expressions ranging from pity to curiosity. He managed a slight smile and raised his beer bottle in a mock toast, playing the role of the good-natured family scapegoat. Inside, he was calculating how much longer he could maintain this charade without compromising his cover. His encrypted phone, disguised as a beat-up Samsung with a cracked screen, vibrated with an incoming message. David glanced at it casually, maintaining his relaxed posture while reading a priority communication from his deputy director. A situation in Eastern Europe required his immediate attention, but it would have to wait. Breaking cover now would put too many operations at risk. You want to know what really bothers me? Jennifer's voice rose another notch. It's that Dave represents everything wrong with veteran reintegration programs. The military spends millions of dollars training people like him, giving them skills and leadership experience, and then they just waste it. She gestured broadly toward David, as if he were a disappointing exhibit in a museum. Look at what the taxpayers invested in him. Marine training, overseas deployments, probably some specialized skills that cost the government a fortune to develop. And what does he do with it? Stock shelves at a hardware store and drive around in a car that should have been scrapped 5 years ago. The hardware store reference hit closer to home than Jennifer could possibly imagine. If she only knew that his part-time job was actually a cover for operations that protected American interests across 3 continents. The specialized skills she mentioned so dismissively included advanced degrees in international relations and strategic intelligence that he'd earned while serving, plus additional training that was so classified it didn't appear on any official record. Tommy returned from helping his grandfather and shot his mother a disapproving look. At 16, he was old enough to recognize cruelty when he saw it, even if it came dressed in patriotic rhetoric and family concern. "Mom," Tommy said quietly, "maybe Uncle Dave doesn't want to talk about this stuff at a family barbecue." Jennifer turned to her son with the same authoritative tone she used with recruits. "Tommy, this is exactly the kind of conversation families should be having. Your uncle needs to hear some hard truths about his situation. Sometimes tough love is the only way to motivate people to change." Uncle Robert stirred in his lawn chair, his sharp old eyes taking in the scene. The Vietnam veteran had been quietly observing his niece's performance, and David could see the disapproval building in his weathered feature. "Jenny," Robert said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from surviving real combat, "maybe you ought to remember that not every story is finished being written yet." But Jennifer was beyond listening to subtle warning. She had momentum now, a captive audience, and the kind of self-righteous confidence that came from believing she held the moral high ground. Tomorrow, her world was going to shatter in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. But tonight, she was still the family's shining military success story, completely unaware that she was humiliating one of the most powerful men in the American defense establishment. The real fireworks were yet to come. The evening air had cooled slightly, but the tension in the Wilson family backyard continued to rise like heat from summer pavement. Jennifer had found her rhythm now, and what had started as casual family criticism was evolving into something much more deliberate and cruel. She seemed to feed off the uncomfortable attention of her relatives, mistaking their silence for agreement rather than embarrassment. "You know what the real tragedy is," Jennifer announced, having moved closer to David's position under the oak tree. Her voice carried that particular tone of authority that she'd perfected during her years of military service. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "It's not just that Dave has given up on himself, it's that he's become a burden on all of us." Uncle Robert's eyes snapped open, the old Vietnam veteran instantly alert. He'd been listening to Jennifer's increasingly harsh commentary, and David could see the disapproval building in his weathered features. Robert had survived real combat, had seen genuine heroes and frauds alike, and he clearly didn't appreciate what his niece was doing. "Now Jenny," Robert began quietly, but Jennifer was beyond listening to subtle warning. "No, Uncle Robert, someone needs to say this," Jennifer interrupted, her captain's bars catching the last rays of sunlight. "I'm tired of pretending that Dave's situation is somehow noble or acceptable. Look around. Do you see anyone else in this family who's struggling like he is?" She gestured broadly at the assembled relatives. "Mark's got his real estate business, Sarah's a successful nurse, Miguel's doing well with his contracting company. Even cousin Paul managed to turn his military experience into a decent civilian career. But Dave stocks shelves and drives a car that barely runs." What Jennifer didn't know was that cousin Paul's decent civilian career had been facilitated by a recommendation letter that David had quietly arranged through his Pentagon contact. Paul's security clearance, essential for his defense contractor job, had been expedited through channels that David controlled. But like so many of David's invisible influences on his family's lives, this help remained completely unknown and unacknowledged. Tommy had returned to sit near his uncle, his teenage face flushed with anger at his mother's public humiliation campaign. At 16, he was old enough to recognize cruelty when he saw it, but young enough to still believe that family meant something more than that. "Mom," Tommy said quietly, "maybe you should just—" "Tommy, this is an adult conversation," Jennifer snapped, her military authority extending even to her own son. Your uncle needs to hear some hard truths about his situation. Sometimes people need to be confronted with their failures before they can change. David remained seated, mechanically peeling the label off his second beer bottle. His encrypted phone had vibrated twice more with priority messages, but he couldn't risk checking them with so many family members watch. Each message likely represented decisions worth millions of dollars, operations affecting national security, or personnel matters involving high-ranking officers. But right now he was just Dave the disappointment, and he had to play the role. I mean, let's be honest about what we're looking at here, Jennifer continued, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she used with new recruits. This is what happens when someone serves their country but doesn't learn the most important lesson the military teaches: personal responsibility and continuous improvement. Their cousin Sarah, the nurse from Atlanta, finally found her voice. Jennifer, I really think. Sarah, please. Jennifer cut her off with a dismissive wave. I know this makes everyone uncomfortable, but someone in this family needs to have an honest conversation with Dave about his choices. We can't keep enabling this resignation. She turned to face David directly for the first time all evening, her eyes hard with the kind of disappointment that only family members could truly master. Dave, when's the last time you had a real plan for your life? When's the last time you set goals and worked toward them? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've just given up entirely. David met her gaze calmly, his expression neutral despite the public humiliation. He'd endured interrogations from foreign intelligence agents, had stared down warlords and arms dealers in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. His sister's amateur psychological assault was child's play compared to what he'd faced in his real job. I'm doing fine, Jennifer, he said quietly, his first words in response to her escalating attacks. Not everyone measures success the same way. Jennifer's laugh was sharp and bitter. Dave, you're living in a one-bedroom apartment, in the worst part of Savannah, driving a car that probably cost more to repair than it's worth, and working part-time at a hardware store. If that's your definition of success, then maybe you need to recalibrate your expectation. What she didn't know was that his one-bedroom apartment was equipped with communication systems that rivaled those at the Pentagon. The broken-down car was regularly serviced by the same team that maintained vehicles for high-ranking government officials, and the part-time hardware store job provided cover for intelligence operations that spanned 3 continents. Miguel, Jennifer's husband, shifted uncomfortably as he continued recording his wife's speech. Even he seemed to recognize that this had crossed the line from family concern into public humiliation. But Jennifer was his wife, and he'd learned long ago not to challenge her when she was in full military mode. And you know what really bothers me about enabling Dave's situation? Jennifer pressed on, now addressing the entire family gathering. It's that we're not helping him by pretending this is okay, we're actually hurting him by not demanding better. Uncle Robert struggled to his feet, his old joints protesting but his resolve clearly strengthening. The Vietnam veteran had heard enough, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd earned the right to speak about real courage and sacrifice. Jenny, Robert said firmly, you need to stop this right now. But Jennifer was beyond listening. She'd built up too much momentum, had too many witnesses to her righteous military authority. In her mind, she was performing a service for both her brother and her family. Uncle Robert, I understand you want to protect Dave, but protection isn't what he needs right now, she said dismissively. What he needs is accountability. What he needs is someone to tell him that his current life choices are unacceptable for a man of his age and experience. She turned back to David, her voice rising with the kind of moral certainty that only comes from believing you hold the high ground. Dave, you served your country honorably, I'll give you that, but service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. You still have obligations, to yourself, to your family, to the taxpayers who invested in your training. David's phone vibrated again, this time with what he recognized as an emergency pattern. Somewhere in the world, a situation was developing that required his immediate attention, but he couldn't break cover, couldn't risk exposing operations that had taken years to develop. So he sat quietly under the oak tree, enduring his sister's public humiliation, while managing a crisis that she couldn't even imagine. Look at me, Jennifer commanded, her captain's authority in full display.
I didn't let the military down when I transitioned to civilian life. I used my training, my leadership experience, my network of contacts. I built something meaningful with the foundation the Army gave me. She gestured to her uniform with obvious pride. This isn't just cloth and metal day. This represents excellence, dedication, the pursuit of something greater than yourself. And right now, you're embarrassing everyone who ever wore the uniform. The family gathering had fallen completely silent, except for the distant sound of children playing and the gentle buzz of insects in the evening air. Everyone could feel the cruelty of what was happening, but Jennifer's military authority and forceful personality had created a social paralysis that prevented intervention. Tomorrow, that authority would crumble in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. But tonight she was still the family's shining military success story, completely unaware that she was publicly humiliating one of the most powerful and decorated officers in the American military establishment. The reckoning was coming, and it would be spectacular.
The Wilson family backyard had become a stage for Jennifer's increasingly cruel performance, and she was building toward what she clearly intended to be her grand finale. The other family members sat in uncomfortable silence, trapped between their reluctance to challenge her military authority and their growing disgust at what they were witnessing. David remained motionless under the oak tree, but those who knew him well could see the subtle changes in his posture, the way his shoulders had straightened almost imperceptibly, the slight tightening around his eyes. "You want to know what really gets me?" Jennifer announced, her voice rising with righteous indignation. "It's not just that Dave has wasted his own potential, it's that he's become a walking advertisement for everything our critics say about veterans. Look at him." This is exactly what anti-military politicians point to when they talk about wasteful spending on veteran programs. She began pacing back and forth in front of David's position, her captain's bars glinting in the fading sunlight as she gestured dramatically. "Here's a man who received some of the best training our military has to offer. Leadership development, tactical expertise, probably specialized schools that cost taxpayers hundreds of thousands of dollars. And what does he have to show for it? A minimum wage job and a car that belongs in a junkyard." Tommy stood up abruptly, his 16-year-old face flushed with anger. "Mom, stop it. Just stop." Jennifer whirled around to face her son, her military bearing in full display. "Tommy Martinez, you will sit down and you will not interrupt conversations. Your uncle needs to hear this, even if it makes everyone uncomfortable." "No, he doesn't," Tommy shot back, his voice cracking with emotion. "You're being cruel, and everyone here knows it. Uncle Dave never did anything to deserve this." For a moment, Jennifer's facade cracked slightly. She wasn't used to direct challenges to her authority, especially not from her own son. But she quickly regained her composure, falling back on the military hierarchy that had served her so well in her career. "Tommy, you're too young to understand the complexities of adult responsibility," she said dismissive. "When you're older, you'll appreciate that sometimes people need to hear hard truths about their choices." Uncle Robert had finally had enough. The old Vietnam veteran struggled to his feet, his weathered hands gripping the arms of his lawn chair for support. At 72, he moved slowly, but when he spoke, his voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had earned his stripes in actual combat. "Jennifer Wilson Martinez," Robert said, using her full name with the kind of quiet authority that made everyone in the backyard stop talking. "You need to shut your mouth right now." The blunt words hung in the evening air like a slap. Jennifer's eyes widened in shock. She wasn't accustomed to being spoken to that way, especially not in front of her family, and certainly not by someone challenging her military credentials. "Uncle Robert, I understand you want to protect Dave, but..." "No," Robert cut her off, his voice growing stronger with each word. "You don't understand anything. You think those captain's bars make you some kind of expert on military service. You think commanding a training battalion gives you the right to humiliate a fellow veteran at a family gathering." Jennifer's face flushed red, but whether from embarrassment or anger was impossible to tell. "I've served my country with distinction for over 20 years. I think I know something about military values and personal responsibility." Robert's laugh was harsh and bitter. "Military values? Is that what you call this public humiliation of your own brother?" In Vietnam, we had a word for people who kicked fellow soldiers when they were down. We called them bullies, and we didn't tolerate them. The old veteran stepped closer to Jennifer, and despite the age difference, she actually took a step backward. There was something in Robert's eyes, a hardness that came from surviving real combat, from facing actual life and death situations, that her training exercises and peacetime commands had never provided. You want to lecture someone about military service? Robert continued, his voice rising. I was in the jungle when you were still in diapers, watching good men die for their country. And let me tell you something, Captain. Those men would be disgusted by what you're doing here tonight. Jennifer tried to regain control of the situation, falling back on her rank and authority. With all due respect, Uncle Robert, the modern military is different from respect. Robert interrupted. You want to talk about respect? Where's your respect for your brother? Where's your respect for his service? You stand there in your pressed uniform talking about military values, while you tear down a fellow veteran in front of his family. David watched the exchange with careful attention, his encrypted phone continuing to vibrate with urgent messages that he couldn't answer without breaking his cover. Somewhere in the world, crises were developing that required his immediate attention, but he remained frozen in his role as the family disappointment. Miguel, Jennifer's husband, had stopped recording and was looking increasingly uncomfortable with the situation. Even he could see that his wife had crossed multiple lines, but years of marriage had taught him not to challenge her when she was in full military mode. Look, Jennifer said, trying to regain control of the narrative, I know this is uncomfortable for everyone, but someone in this family needs to have an honest conversation with Dave. We can't keep enabling his situation by pretending it's acceptable. Aunt Margaret finally spoke up, her retired teacher's voice sharp with disapproval. Jennifer, dear, the only thing I see being enabled here is your cruelty. That boy has never asked anyone in this family for money or help. He's quiet, respectful, and he shows up to family gatherings with a smile on his face. What more do you want from him? Jennifer's military training had taught her to maintain composure under pressure, but the combined challenges from multiple family members were clearly rattling her. She looked around the backyard, searching for supporters, but found only uncomfortable faces and disapproving stares. I want him to live up to his potential, she said defensively. I want him to stop wasting the investment our country made in him. I want him to be something more than a cautionary tale about failed veteran reintegration. Cousin Sarah, the nurse from Atlanta, stood up from the picnic table where she'd been sitting. Jennifer, I've heard what you're doing isn't helpful, it isn't kind, and it isn't what families do to each other. Sarah, you don't understand the situation. I understand that you've spent the last hour publicly humiliating your brother at what's supposed to be a family celebration. Sarah, interrupt. I understand that you've made everyone here uncomfortable with your cruelty. And I understand that if you were my sister, I'd be ashamed of your behavior. The words hit Jennifer like physical blows. She looked around the backyard again, finally beginning to realize that her military authority meant nothing here, that her rank couldn't protect her from the consequences of her actions. But rather than backing down, Jennifer doubled down on her position. Pride and stubbornness, traits that had served her well in her military career, now pushed her to make one final devastating attack. Fine, she said, her voice cold and controlled. If you all want to enable Dave's failure, that's your choice. But don't pretend that what he's become is something to be proud of. Look at him sitting there, silent, defeated, resigned to mediocrity. That's not the brother I grew up with. That's just a shadow of a man who gave up on himself. She turned to face David directly, her eyes hard with disappointment and disgust. Dave, I'm sorry if the truth hurts, but someone needs to say it. You're 45 years old, and you have nothing to show for your life. No career, no prospects, no ambition. You're an embarrassment to the uniform you once wore, and you're an embarrassment to this family. The backyard fell completely silent, except for the distant sound of traffic and the gentle buzz of insects in the evening air. Jennifer had finally said the words that couldn't be taken back, had crossed the line that would change everything. What she didn't know was that tomorrow morning would bring a visitor who would shatter her carefully constructed world and reveal just how catastrophically wrong she had been about everything. The reckoning was less than 12 hours away. The next morning dawned bright and clear over the Wilson family property, but the atmosphere in the house was anything but peaceful. Jennifer had left the barbecue the night before in a storm of righteous indignation, dragging Miguel and Tommy with her after her final devastating attack on David. The rest of the family had dispersed in uncomfortable silence, leaving David to help Uncle Robert clean up the backyard while they both processed what had happened. Now at 9:30 a.m., Jennifer was back, having returned to continue the conversation as she'd put it to Miguel over breakfast. She'd spent the night justifying her actions, convincing herself that her family's negative reaction was simply their inability to handle difficult truths. In her mind, she was still the rational adult trying to help a struggling brother, even if her methods had been harsh. David was sitting on the front porch with a cup of coffee, still playing his role as the defeated veteran. His encrypted phone had been buzzing all night with increasingly urgent messages, but maintaining his cover remained paramount. Lives depended on his anonymity, and no amount of personal humiliation was worth compromising operations that protected American interests around the world. Jennifer pulled into the driveway in her pristine white SUV, her army uniform once again immaculate and perfectly prepped. She'd clearly prepared for another confrontation, armed with what she believed was moral authority and military righteousness. Tommy remained in the passenger seat, his teenage face sullen with embarrassment over his mother's behavior. "Dave," Jennifer called out as she approached the porch, her voice carrying that familiar tone of military authority. "I think we need to finish our conversation from last night. Some things were said that needed to be said, but I want to make sure you understand that everything I did came from a place of caring." David looked up from his coffee, his expression carefully neutral. "Jennifer, I think enough was said last night. Maybe we should just—" "No," she interrupted, her captain's training taking over. "Running away from difficult conversations is exactly the kind of behavior that's gotten you into this situation. We need to address the elephant in the room." What Jennifer didn't notice was the black sedan that had turned onto their street, moving slowly as if the driver was checking addresses. The car was unremarkable, exactly the kind of vehicle that government officials used when they wanted to blend in. But David noticed it immediately, and a cold dread settled in his stomach. "Jennifer," he said quietly, "maybe this isn't the best time. There's never going to be a good time for this conversation," she replied, settling into the porch chair across from him. "Look, I know last night was uncomfortable for everyone, but sometimes families need to have hard conversations. You can't keep living in denial about your situation." The black sedan had stopped in front of the house, and David watched with growing concern as a tall man in a crisp military uniform stepped out. Even from a distance, David could see the silver eagles on the man's shoulders, a full colonel. His heart sank as he recognized Colonel Marcus Chen, his deputy director at the Defense Intelligence Agency. This was exactly what David had been trying to avoid for the past 2 years. Chen wouldn't be here unless there was an emergency that couldn't wait, something so urgent that it required breaking David's carefully maintained cover. "You see, Dave," Jennifer continued, oblivious to the approaching figure, "the problem isn't that you've hit a rough patch. Everyone has setbacks. The problem is that you've accepted mediocrity as your permanent condition. You've given up on yourself, and that's not the brother I remember." Colonel Chen was walking up the front walkway now, his expression grim and purposeful. He carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a senior military officer, and his uniform displayed an impressive array of ribbons and decorations. This was clearly someone important, someone with serious business to conduct. "The truth is," Jennifer pressed on, warming to her theme, "you represent everything that's wrong with veteran support programs. The military invests millions in training people like you, and then you just waste it. You become a burden on society instead of a contributor." "Excuse me," Colonel Chen called out as he reached the bottom of the porch steps, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'm looking for David Wilson." Jennifer turned around, immediately noting the colonel's rank and impressive uniform. Her military training kicked in automatically. This was clearly a senior officer, someone deserving of respect and attention. She stood up quickly, her own captain's bearing evident as she prepared to interact with a superior officer. "I'm Captain Jennifer Wilson Martinez," she said formally, offering a slight nod of respect. "David Wilson is my brother." May I ask who's calling? Colonel Chen's eyes moved from Jennifer to David, and there was something in his expression, a mixture of urgency and barely contained frustration, that suggested this visit was not routine. Colonel Marcus Chen, Defense Intelligence Agency, he replied, his words causing Jennifer's eyes to widen slightly. The DIA was serious business, not the kind of organization that made casual social calls. I need to speak with Mr. Wilson immediately regarding an urgent matter. David felt his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. 2 years of maintaining his cover, 2 years of enduring family gatherings as the disappointing brother, and now it was all about to be exposed because of some crisis that couldn't wait. "I'm sorry, Colonel," Jennifer interjected, her voice taking on a protective tone, "but I think there might be some mistake. My brother is retired from the military, he's been out of service for 2 years now, and he's currently working at a hardware store." "Are you sure you have the right David Wilson?" Colonel Chen's expression shifted slightly, and David could see the moment when his deputy realized what was happening. Chen was a smart man, and he'd clearly picked up on the family dynamics playing out on the porch. "Ma'am," Chen said carefully, "I can assure you that I have the correct David Wilson. This is a matter of national security that requires his immediate attention." Jennifer's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. "Colonel, with all due respect, I think you've made an error. My brother stocks shelves at a hardware store. He drives a car that barely runs and lives in a one-bedroom apartment. Whatever national security matter you're dealing with, I can guarantee you that Dave isn't the person you're looking for." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on Dave. Here was his sister, who had spent the last 24 hours publicly humiliating him for his apparent lack of success, now trying to protect him from what she assumed was a case of mistaken identity. In her mind, there was no way her failure of a brother could be involved in anything as important as national security. Colonel Chen looked directly at David, and there was a question in his eyes. How much should he reveal? How much of the cover story should he maintain in front of family members who clearly had no idea who David really was? "Mr. Wilson," Chen said formally, "we have a situation developing in Eastern Europe that requires your immediate attention. The Secretary of Defense is waiting for your briefing, and we have a secure line set up for your input on the operational response." Jennifer's face went pale. She looked back and forth between the colonel and her brother, trying to process what she was hearing. In her mind, this had to be some kind of mistake, some bureaucratic error that would be cleared up once the colonel realized he was talking to a hardware store employee. "There has to be some confusion here," she said weakly, her voice lacking its usual authority. "Dave, tell him about your job, about your situation." David looked at his sister, the woman who had spent the previous evening calling him an embarrassment to the family in the uniform, and realized that his 2-year charade was finally over. "Jennifer," he said quietly, "we need to talk." The silence on the front porch stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jennifer stood frozen between her brother and the colonel, her mind struggling to process what she was hearing. In her world, there were clear categories: successful military officers and failed veterans. There was no middle ground. No possibility that someone could appear to be one thing while actually being something completely different. Colonel Chen checked his watch with obvious impatience. "Sir, I hate to press, but the situation is deteriorating rapidly. We've got approximately 6 hours before the window closes, and the secretary is waiting for your strategic assessment." "Sir," Jennifer repeated weakly, looking back and forth between the two men. "Colonel, I think you're confused. Dave isn't an officer. He's retired enlisted. He works at Captain Wilson Martinez," David said quietly, his voice carrying a subtle but unmistakable tone of authority that Jennifer had never heard before. "I need you to step inside for a moment while I handle this." There was something different about the way he spoke, not the defeated, resigned tone she'd grown accustomed to over the past 2 years, but something that reminded her uncomfortably of her own commanders when they were issuing orders that weren't open to discussion. "Dave, what's going on?" Jennifer asked, her voice smaller than it had been in years. "I don't understand what's happening here." Tommy had gotten out of the SUV and was approaching the porch, his teenage curiosity overriding his mother's instructions to stay in the car. "Uncle Dave, who is this guy?" Colonel Chen glanced at David with raised eyebrows.
clearly asking for guidance on how much to reveal in front of family members. David's carefully maintained cover was crumbling in real time, and every second of delay was making the situation worse. "Colonel," David said formally, "give me 2 minutes to brief my family, then we'll need to take this conversation to a secure location." "Understood, sir," Chen replied, stepping back to give them space while maintaining his position near the porch steps. Jennifer's face went white. She'd spent 20 years in the military, and she knew the sound of someone receiving a status report from a subordinate, but that was impossible. Dave was her younger brother, the family failure, the veteran who couldn't adjust to civilian life. "Dave," she whispered, "why did he call you sir?" David looked at his sister, the woman who had spent the previous evening calling him an embarrassment to the family, and the uniform, and realized there was no way to ease into this revelation. The cover was blown, the operation was compromised, and the only thing left was damage control. "Jennifer, what I'm about to tell you cannot leave this porch," he said, his voice taking on the crisp authority of someone accustomed to giving classified briefing. "For the past 2 years I've been living under a cover identity designed to protect ongoing intelligence operations. My real rank is general, and I'm currently the deputy director of the Defense Intelligence Agency." The words hit Jennifer like a physical blow. She actually stumbled backward, gripping the porch railing for support. That's not possible. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment. You drive a beat-up Honda. You stock shelves at a hardware store. The apartment is a safe house," David explained quickly, aware that Colonel Chen was growing more impatient by the second. "The car is part of my cover identity, and the hardware store is a front operation that allows me to maintain contact with intelligence assets without raising suspicion." Tommy's eyes widened as he processed what his uncle was saying. "So you're like a spy or something?" "Something like that," David replied, then turned back to his sister. "Jennifer, the man you've been calling a failure for the past 2 years controls an annual budget of over $50 billion, and oversees intelligence operations on 6 continents. Jennifer's legs seemed to give out, and she sank into the porch chair she'd been occupying just minutes earlier. Her mind was reeling, trying to reconcile everything she thought she knew about her brother with this impossible revelation. But you never said anything," she stammered. "All those times all the things I said about your life, about your choices." "I couldn't say anything," David replied. "Too many lives depend on my anonymity. Too many operations rely on the fact that no one knows who I really am." Colonel Chen cleared his throat diplomatically. "General, I really need to stress the urgency of the situation. We have assets in the field who are depending on your decision." Jennifer's head snapped up at the word general. She stared at her brother with new eyes, suddenly seeing details she'd missed before: the way he carried himself, the alertness in his eyes, the quiet confidence that she'd mistaken for resignation. "General," she repeated in a whisper. "You're a general?" 3-star, David confirmed. "I was promoted 18 months ago, but obviously that's not something I could share with the family." The implications were crashing over Jennifer like a tsunami. Every criticism she'd made, every lecture about military values and personal responsibility, every cruel comment about his failure to live up to his potential, all of it had been directed at one of the most senior officers in the United States military. "Oh my God," she breathed, her face flushing with embarrassment and horror. "Dave, I'm so sorry, I had no idea. All those things I said last night, we'll discuss that later," David said firmly. "Right now, I have a job to do." He turned to Colonel Chen. "Marcus, I assume we're dealing with the Eastern European situation that's been developing all week." "Yes, sir. The intelligence you've been tracking has proven accurate. We have a narrow window to intercept the target, but it requires your authorization for the operation." David nodded grimly. "How many assets are in position?" 12, sir, all waiting for your go-no-go decision." Jennifer watched this exchange in stunned silence, finally understanding that she was witnessing something far beyond her clearance level or her understanding. This wasn't her unsuccessful brother anymore. This was a senior military officer dealing with matters of national security. "Uncle Dave," Tommy said quietly, "are you really important?" David glanced at his nephew with something approaching a smile. "I suppose you could say that, Tommy." "How important?" the teenager pressed. Colonel Chen answered before David could respond. Your uncle is one of the 10 most powerful people in the American defense establishment. There are maybe 50 people in the entire government who outrank him. Jennifer felt like she was going to be sick. The magnitude of her mistake was becoming clear, and it went far beyond simple family embarrassment. She'd spent the previous evening publicly humiliating one of the most senior officers in the United States military. The McLean mansion, she said suddenly, the pieces starting to fall into place. That's not just a safe house, is it? That's my actual residence, David confirmed. 12,000 square feet, private security, secure communications center. I bought it with cash 3 years ago, and I have 7 vehicles including an armored BMW that costs more than most people's houses. Jennifer was struggling to breathe. The hardware store job, cover for intelligence operations spanning 3 continents. Each revelation was like another hammer blow to Jennifer's sense of reality. Everything she thought she knew about her brother, every assumption she'd made about his life and his choices, had been catastrophically wrong. Sir, Colonel Chen said gently, we really do need to move on then. David nodded and stood up, his posture straightening into the bearing of a senior military officer. The transformation was remarkable. In just a few moments, he'd gone from appearing to be a defeated veteran, to looking every inch the 3-star general he actually was. Jennifer, he said quietly, we're going to have a very long conversation about what happened last night, but right now I have 12 operatives in the field, whose lives depend on the decision I'm about to make. As he walked toward Colonel Chen's sedan, Jennifer remained frozen in her chair, staring after the brother she'd never really known at all.
Jennifer sat on the front porch in stunned silence, watching her brother disappear into the black sedan with Colonel Chen. The car pulled away with quiet efficiency, leaving her alone with Tommy and the wreckage of everything she thought they knew about her family. Her hands were shaking as she tried to process the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "Mom," Tommy said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. "Uncle Dave is a general?" Jennifer nodded numbly, unable to find her voice. The teenager's question hung in the air between them, but the implications were far too complex for her to explain. How could she tell her son that she'd spent the previous evening publicly humiliating one of the most powerful officers in the United States military? How could she explain that every cruel word she'd spoken had been directed at someone who controlled operations she couldn't even imagine? The front door opened, and Uncle Robert stepped onto the porch, his weathered face creased with concern. The old Vietnam veteran had been watching from inside the house, and it was clear from his expression that he'd understood more of the conversation than Jennifer had initially realized. "Rough morning?" Robert asked quietly, settling into his favorite chair with the careful movements of a man whose joints had seen better days. "Uncle Robert," Jennifer said weakly, Did you have any idea about Dave?" The old veteran was quiet for a long moment, studying his niece's pale face with eyes that had seen too much over the years. "I suspected something," he admitted finally. "Man doesn't carry himself like Dave does if he's really what he pretends to be. Those eyes I've seen that look before, in officers who've had to make life and death decisions." Jennifer felt a new wave of nausea wash over her. "But why didn't you say anything? All those times I criticized him, all those lectures about military values and personal responsibility." "Wasn't my place to say," Robert replied with a shrug. "Figure a man's got his reasons for keeping secrets, especially when those secrets might involve national security. Besides," he added with a pointed look, "seemed to me like Dave was handling your lectures just fine." Tommy was staring at his grandfather with wide eyes. "Grandpa Robert, how important is Uncle Dave really? That colonel guy said he was one of the most powerful people in the defense thing." "Defense establishment," Robert corrected gently. "And if what that colonel said is true, then your uncle outranks just about every officer your mother has ever served under. 3-star general at his age. That's not something that happens by accident, Tommy. That's the kind of rank you only get if you're exceptional at what you do." Jennifer buried her face in her hands as the full weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. Every word she'd spoken at the barbecue, every cruel criticism and dismissive comment, had been directed at someone who could end her military career with a single phone call. But more than that, she'd publicly humiliated her own brother, not just in front of their family, but in front of someone who was apparently one of the most important people in American national security. "I called him an embarrassment," she whispered through her finger. "I said he was wasting taxpayer money and that he was a failure as a veteran. I said he was an embarrassment to the uniform." Robert's expression hardened. "Well, now you know better. Question is, what are you going to do about it?" Before Jennifer could respond, her phone buzzed with an incoming text message. She glanced at it automatically, then felt her blood turn to ice. The message was from Colonel Patricia Morrison, her battalion commander at Fort Stewart. "Captain Wilson Martinez, I need to see you in my office at 1400 hours today. We need to discuss your conduct at a family gathering last night. This is not optional." Jennifer's hands began shaking as she read the message again. Somehow, word of what had happened at the barbecue had already reached her commanding officer. In the military, bad news traveled fast. But this was beyond anything she'd ever experienced. "What is it?" Tommy asked, noticing his mother's pale complexion. "My commanding officer wants to see me," Jennifer said weakly. "She knows about last night." Uncle Robert raised an eyebrow. "That was fast. Your brother works quick when he needs to." "You think Dave called her?" Jennifer asked, a new fear creeping into her voice. "Don't have to," Robert replied. "Man in his position, there are probably people whose job it is to monitor threats to his security. Public humiliation by a family member at a barbecue, that's the kind of thing that gets attention from people you don't want attention from." Jennifer's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from an unknown number. She answered it hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Captain Wilson Martinez, this is Major General Patricia Hawks, Fort Stewart Command. I need you to report to my office immediately for a security brief. You are not to discuss this call with anyone outside your immediate family." The line went dead, leaving Jennifer staring at her phone in horror. A major general, someone who outranked her battalion commander, was now involved in whatever was happening. In her 20 years of military service, she'd never been summoned by anyone above the rank of colonel. "That was a major general," she told Robert and Tommy, her voice barely audible. "She wants to see me for a security briefing." Robert whistled low. "Security briefing means they think you might be a threat to someone important. Given what we just learned about your brother, I'd say that assessment might be accurate." Tommy was looking back and forth between his mother and great-uncle with growing confusion. "Mom, are you in trouble?" "Like real trouble." Jennifer didn't know how to answer. In the space of 30 minutes, her entire world had been turned upside down. The brother she'd spent years pitying and criticizing was actually one of the most powerful people in the American military. The family gathering where she'd felt so righteously superior had apparently been monitored by people whose job it was to protect national security assets. "I think I might be," she admitted quietly. Her phone buzzed with another message, this time from Miguel. "Jenny, something's happening at the base. They're asking questions about you and Dave. Whatever happened last night, it's bigger than we thought. Come home now." Robert studied his niece's increasingly panicked expression with the kind of calm that came from decades of military experience. "Jennifer, you need to understand something. Your brother didn't just hide his rank from you, he hid his entire life. That means people have been watching, people have been listening, and people have been taking notes." "What do you mean?" she asked weakly. "I mean everything you said last night was probably recorded by someone whose job it is to monitor threats to high-value assets. I mean your public humiliation of a 3-star general has probably been documented, analyzed and reported up through channels you didn't even know existed." The implications hit Jennifer like a physical blow. Not only had she publicly humiliated her brother, but she'd done it in front of people whose job it was to protect him. Her military career, her reputation, her entire future was now in the hands of security personnel who viewed her as a potential threat to someone they were sworn to protect. Tommy was staring at his mother with a mixture of concern and fascination. "Mom, what happens now?" Jennifer looked at her son, then at Uncle Robert, then at the empty driveway where the black sedan had been parked just minutes earlier. "I don't know, Tommy. I honestly don't know." But she was starting to understand that the consequences of her actions were going to be far more severe than a simple family argument. She'd humiliated a 3-star general, and now she was about to discover what that really meant. 2 hours later, Jennifer sat in the sterile waiting room outside Major General Patricia Hawks' office at Fort Stewart, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. The drive from her family's house had been a blur of panic and disbelief, with Miguel trying unsuccessfully to calm her down while Tommy peppered her with questions she couldn't answer. The base felt different now that she understood what had happened. Every security guard who looked at her twice, every officer who glanced in her direction, every camera mounted on the buildings, all of it took on new significance. She was no longer Captain Jennifer Wilson Martinez, respected battalion commander. She was now a potential security threat who had publicly humiliated a three-star general. Captain Wilson Martinez, a young lieutenant, appeared at the waiting room door, his expression carefully neutral. "The general will see you." Jennifer stood on unsteady legs, smoothing her uniform one final time before following the lieutenant down a corridor lined with portraits of distinguished officers. She wondered if David's picture was somewhere in these halls, hidden among the faces of generals whose names she'd never bothered to learn. Major General Hawks' office was impressive. Mahogany furniture, military memorabilia, and enough ribbons and commendations on the walls to make Jennifer's own modest collection look insignificant. The general herself was a formidable woman in her late 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. "Captain Wilson Martinez," General Hawks said without looking up from the file on her desk. "Please, have a seat." Jennifer sat down carefully, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She'd been in similar situations before: performance reviews, disciplinary meetings, routine briefings, but never with this level of dread settling in her stomach. "I'm going to be direct with you, Captain," General Hawks began, finally looking up from the file. "Yesterday evening, you attended a family barbecue where you publicly humiliated a man you believed to be an unsuccessful veteran. Is that an accurate summary of events?" "Yes, ma'am," Jennifer replied quietly. "And during this public humiliation, you made statements about this individual's failure to live up to military values, his waste of taxpayer investment in his training, and his general unsuitability as a representative American veteran." Each word felt like a physical blow. "Yes, ma'am." General Hawks leaned back in her chair, studying Jennifer with the kind of cold assessment that made seasoned officers squirm. "Captain, are you familiar with General David Wilson?" Jennifer's breath caught in her throat. I am now, ma'am." General Wilson is currently the Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He oversees operations involving thousands of personnel across 6 continents and controls budgets that exceed the GDP of most small nations. He has been instrumental in preventing 3 major terrorist attacks over the past 18 months, and his intelligence operations have saved countless American lives. The weight of these words settled on Jennifer's shoulders like a physical burden. "Yes, ma'am." "General Wilson is also, I understand, your brother?" "Yes, ma'am." General Hawks opened the file and began reading from what appeared to be a transcript. Quote, "Dave represents everything wrong with veteran reintegration program. The military spends millions of dollars training people like him, and then they just waste it." "Did you say that, Captain?" Jennifer felt her face burning with shame. "Yes, ma'am." Quote, "You're an embarrassment to the uniform you once wore, and you're an embarrassment to this family." "Did you say that as well?" "Yes, ma'am," Jennifer whispered. General Hawks closed the file and studied Jennifer with an expression that was somehow worse than anger. It was "Captain, in my 30 years of military service, I have rarely encountered such a fundamental failure of judgment and military bearing. You publicly humiliated one of the most senior officers in the United States military based on incomplete information and personal assumption." Jennifer wanted to explain, wanted to defend herself, but there were no words that could possibly justify what she had done. "Ma'am, I had no idea about my brother's actual position. His cover identity was classified for reasons involving national security," General Hawks interrupted sharply. "Your failure to recognize that your brother might have valid reasons for maintaining his privacy demonstrates a shocking lack of military judgment." The general stood up and moved to the window overlooking the base parade ground. "Captain," Do you understand the position you've put us in? We have a battalion commander who has demonstrated that she cannot be trusted with sensitive information, who makes assumptions about fellow veterans without proper investigation, and who publicly humiliates her own family members based on superficial observation. Jennifer felt her military career crumbling around her. Ma'am, you will not speak unless I ask you a direct question, General Hawks said without turning around. Right now, there are people in Washington asking whether you represent a security risk. There are intelligence officials wondering if your behavior indicates some deeper problem with your judgment or your loyalty. The implications hit Jennifer like a sledgehammer. She wasn't just facing discipline for poor conduct, she was facing questions about her suitability for military service entirely. General Wilson has requested that no disciplinary action be taken against you, General Hawks continued, finally turning back to face Jennifer. He has indicated that family matters should remain family matters, and that your behavior, while deeply inappropriate, does not constitute a security threat. Jennifer felt a wave of relief, followed immediately by a deeper shame. Even after everything she had done, David was still protecting her. However, General Hawks continued, I am not bound by General Wilson's recommendation. You serve under my command and your conduct reflects on this entire installation. The general returned to her desk and picked up another file. Captain, you have two choices. You can accept immediate reassignment to a position that does not require security clearance, essentially ending your career as a combat arms officer, or you can request voluntary separation from the military with full benefits. Jennifer's world collapsed. 20 years of service, 20 years of building her identity around her military career, and it was all ending because of one evening of cruel family drama. Ma'am, she said quietly, may I ask how you learned about what happened at the barbecue? General Hawks smiled grimly. Captain, when you publicly humiliate a 3-star general, there are people whose job it is to document such incidents. Your entire conversation was recorded by protective details, whose responsibility it is to monitor potential threats to high-value assets. The record. Jennifer realized with growing horror that not only had her cruel words been overheard by family members, but they had been professionally documented by intelligence personnel whose job it was to protect her brother. The good news, General Hawks continued, is that the recording also demonstrates that General Wilson maintained perfect operational security throughout the incident. His cover identity remained intact until this morning's emergency required him to break cover. Jennifer stared at her hands, understanding now that every word she'd spoken had been analyzed by professionals who viewed her as a potential security threat to someone they were sworn to protect. Captain, I need your decision, General Hawks said firmly. Reassignment or separation. Those are your only options. Jennifer tucked up at the general, then at the portraits of distinguished officers lining the walls, then back at her own hands. Her military career was over, destroyed by her own arrogance and cruelty toward the brother she'd never bothered to truly understand. Ma'am, she said quietly, I'll take the reassignment. But even as she spoke the words, Jennifer knew that her life as she'd known it was finished. The woman who had lectured her brother about military values and personal responsibility had just discovered what real consequences looked like. Jennifer walked out of Major General Hawks's office in a daze, her 20-year military career effectively over. The reassignment she'd accepted would move her to a logistics position with no command authority, no security clearance, and no hope of advance. It was military purgatory. Technically still serving but stripped of everything that had defined her identity as an officer. Miguel was waiting in the parking lot, his face etched with worry and confusion. Tommy sat in the passenger seat, staring at his phone but clearly listening for any sign of what had happened inside. When Jennifer approached the car, both of them could see from her expression that the news wasn't good. How bad? Miguel asked quietly as Jennifer slumped into the driver's seat. 20 years, Jennifer said, her voice hollow. 20 years of service, and it's all gone because of one night of family drama. Tommy looked up from his phone, his teenage face creased with concern. Mom, what happens now? Jennifer started the engine, her hands moving automatically through familiar motions, while her mind struggled to process the magnitude of what had happened. Now I spend the rest of my military career pushing papers in a supply depot, no command, no advancement, The drive home was silent, except for the hum of tires on asphalt and the occasional beep of Tommy's phone. Jennifer's mind kept replaying the conversation with General Hawks, each word a reminder of how catastrophically wrong she'd been about everything. When they pulled into their driveway, Jennifer was surprised to see Uncle Robert's old pickup truck parked at the curb. The Vietnam veteran was sitting on their front porch, his weathered hands folded over his walking cane as he watched them approach. "Uncle Rob," Jennifer said as she got out of the car. "What are you doing here?" The old veteran stood up slowly, his sharp eyes taking in Jennifer's defeated posture and pale complexion. "Figured you might need someone to talk to who understands what it means when the military comes calling." They settled on the front porch, with Miguel retreating inside to give them privacy, and Tommy hovering nearby, clearly torn between respecting adult conversation and satisfying his teenage curiosity about his uncle's secret life. "How bad was it?" Robert asked without preamble. Jennifer laughed bitterly. "They had recordings, Uncle Robert, professional recordings of everything I said last night. Apparently, when you publicly humiliate a 3-star general, there are people whose job it is to document it." Robert nodded grimly. "Protection detail. Makes sense. Man in Dave's position, they probably monitor everything around him for potential threats." "Threats," Jennifer repeated, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. "They classified me as a potential threat to my own brother." "Well," Robert said with characteristic bluntness, "you did spend an evening publicly attacking someone who controls billion-dollar budgets and international intelligence operations. From their perspective, that probably does look threatening." Tommy perched on the porch steps, his phone forgotten as he listened to the conversation. "Grandpa Robert, is Uncle Dave like the most important person we know?" Robert considered the question carefully. "Tommy, your uncle probably has more real power than most senators, more influence than most corporate CEOs, and more responsibility than most cabinet members. So yeah, I'd say he's probably the most important person any of us will ever know personally." The weight of this statement settled over Jennifer like a blanket of shame. She'd spent years feeling superior to her brother, years believing that her captain's bars and battalion command made her the family success story. Now she understood that David had been operating at a level so far above her own that her achievements seemed laughable in comparison. "The worst part," Jennifer said quietly, "is that he tried to protect me. Even after everything I said, even after I called him an embarrassment to the family and the uniform, he requested that no disciplinary action be taken against me." Robert's expression softened slightly. "That sounds like the Dave I remember. Boy, never could hold a grudge, even when people deserved it." Jennifer's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it, then felt her stomach drop. It was from Colonel Morrison, her former battalion commander. "Jennifer, word is spreading about what happened. Several officers are asking questions about your judgment and fitness for command. You might want to consider getting ahead of this before it gets worse." "What is it?" Robert asked, noticing her pale complexion. "The story is spreading through the base," Jennifer said weakly. "Other officers are starting to hear about what happened." Robert whistled low. "Military gossip travels fast, especially when it involves someone as high-ranking as your brother. By tomorrow, every officer at Fort Stewart will know that their former battalion commander publicly humiliated a 3-star general." Tommy was staring at his mother with growing concern. "Mom, are people going to make fun of you?" Jennifer didn't know how to answer. In the military, reputation was everything, and hers was now permanently tainted. Every officer who heard the story would remember her as the captain who was so clueless about her own brother that she'd publicly attacked one of the most powerful people in the Defense Department. "Uncle Robert," she said quietly, "how do I come back from this? How do I rebuild my career after something like this?" The old veteran was quiet for a long moment, studying the evening sky with eyes that had seen too much over the years. "Jennifer, sometimes you don't come back. Sometimes you just have to learn to live with the consequences of your choices." "But I didn't know," she protested. "I had no idea about Dave's real position. His cover story was perfect. How was I supposed to know he was lying about everything?" Robert's laugh was hard. "He wasn't lying, Jenny. He was protecting national security. There's a difference between deception and operational security,
and any officer worth her salt should understand that. The words hit Jennifer like a slap. Even Uncle Robert, who'd been supportive throughout her military career, was holding her accountable for her failure to recognize the obvious signs that her brother was more than he appeared to be. Besides, Robert continued, the cover story doesn't excuse the cruelty. Even if Dave really had been a struggling veteran working at a hardware store, that wouldn't have justified the way you treated him. You attacked him publicly, humiliated him in front of his family, and showed a complete lack of military bearing and basic human decency. Jennifer felt tears building in her eyes as the full weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. It wasn't just that she'd been wrong about David's circumstances, it was that her behavior had been fundamentally cruel and unmilitary regardless of who the target was. What do I do now? She asked quietly. Robert leaned forward in his chair, his weathered hands gripping his cane. Now you do what every soldier does when they screw up. You own your mistake, you accept the consequences, and you try to be better going forward. And maybe, if you're lucky, your brother will eventually forgive you for what you did. As if summoned by their conversation, a familiar black sedan turned onto their street. Jennifer's heart rate spiked as she recognized the vehicle from that morning. David was coming back and she had no idea what she was going to say to him. The reckoning with her brother was finally at hand.
The black sedan pulled into Jennifer's driveway with the same quiet efficiency it had displayed that morning, but everything else had changed. This time, Jennifer knew exactly who was getting out of that car, and the weight of that knowledge sat on her chest like a physical burden. David emerged from the passenger seat, no longer maintaining the slouched posture of a defeated veteran. His bearing was upright, confident, and unmistakably that of a senior military officer. Colonel Chen remained in the driver's seat, engine running, suggesting this would be a brief conversation. David walked up the front walkway with measured steps, his eyes taking in the scene on the porch. Jennifer pale and defeated, Uncle Robert watchful and stern, Tommy hovering between curiosity and concern. Uncle Robert, David said with genuine warmth, extending his hand to the old Vietnam veteran. Good to see you. Robert stood up carefully, gripping David's hand with surprising strength. General, he said formally, using the rank for the first time. Heard you had quite a morning. Among other things, David replied, his eyes moving to Jennifer. The look he gave her wasn't angry, exactly, but it was cold and assessing, the look of someone evaluating a situation that required careful handling. Tommy, David continued, acknowledging his nephew with a slight smile. I suppose this has been an interesting day for you. Uncle Dave, I mean General Wilson, Tommy stammered, clearly unsure how to address his uncle now that he knew the truth. Is it okay if I still call you Uncle Dave? David's expression softened slightly. Tommy, I'm still your uncle. The rank doesn't change that. Jennifer remained seated, unable to meet her brother's eyes. The confident, lecturing woman from the previous evening had been replaced by someone who looked smaller, diminished by the magnitude of her mistake and its consequences. Jennifer, David said quietly, we need to talk. She finally looked up at him, and for the first time in years, she saw her brother clearly. The alertness in his eyes that she'd mistaken for wariness, the controlled way he moved that she'd interpreted as resignation, the careful way he spoke that she'd dismissed as defeat, all of it made sense now. This was a man accustomed to command, to making decisions that affected thousands of lives, to operating in a world where mistakes could cost lives. Dave, she began, her voice barely above a whisper, I'm so sorry. I had no idea. That's the problem, Jennifer. David interrupted, his voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to giving orders. You had no idea, but you spoke anyway. You made assumptions, and then you built an entire campaign of public humiliation based on those assumptions. Uncle Robert shifted in his chair, clearly uncomfortable with the tension but unwilling to leave during what was obviously a critical family moment. Tommy looked back and forth between his mother and uncle, his teenage face creased with worry. I know, Jennifer said, tears building in her eyes. I know I was wrong. About everything. I called you an embarrassment, and I was the one who should have been embarrassed. I lectured you about military values while showing none myself. David studied his sister's face, and Jennifer could see him making the same kind of careful assessment she'd watched him perform with Colonel Chen that morning. This wasn't her brother the family disappointment. This was General Wilson evaluating a situation that had implications far beyond simple family drama. Jennifer, do you understand what happened today? David, do you understand why your commanding officer called you in? Why you're facing reassignment? Why your entire military career is now in question? Because I humiliated you, Jennifer said quietly. Because I attacked a 3-star general in public. No, David said firmly. That's not why this happened. This happened because you demonstrated a fundamental failure of judgment and military bearing. You showed that you make important decisions based on incomplete information. You proved that you're willing to publicly attack fellow veterans without understanding their circumstances. The words hit Jennifer like physical blows, each one precisely targeted and devastatingly accurate. The rank isn't what matters here, David continued. What matters is that you took someone you believed to be a struggling veteran and decided to humiliate them publicly at a family gathering. That behavior would have been wrong regardless of who I actually am. Uncle Robert nodded approvingly from his chair. Boy's got a point, Jen. Even if Dave really had been working at a hardware store, what you did last night was cruel and unmilitary. Jennifer buried her face in her hands, finally understanding that her mistake went far deeper than simply misjudging her brother's circumstance. She'd revealed something ugly about her own character, something that called into question her fitness for military leadership. Dave, she said through her fingers, they told me you requested no disciplinary action. After everything I said, after I called you an embarrassment to the uniform, you still tried to protect me. I did, David confirmed, because despite what you think of me, I still consider you my sister. Family matters should remain family matters when possible. Jennifer looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. But your behavior reflects on more than just our family, David said. It reflects on your judgment as an officer, your suitability for command, and your understanding of military value. Those are decisions that your chain of command has to make. Tommy had been listening to this exchange with growing understanding of just how badly his mother had misjudged the situation. Mom, he said quietly, Uncle Dave could have gotten you kicked out of the army completely, couldn't? David glanced at his nephew, then back at Jennifer. Tommy, your mother's military career is between her and her commanders, but yes, publicly humiliating a senior officer is typically grounds for serious disciplinary action. The weight of this statement settled over Jennifer like a shroud. Not only had David protected her from the worst consequences of her actions, but he'd done it despite having every reason to let the military justice system run its course. Why? Jennifer asked quietly. Why protect me after what I did? David was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the evening sky with the same expression Jennifer had seen on the faces of her own commanders when they were weighing difficult decisions. Because 24 hours ago you were my sister who didn't know any better, he said fine. Today you're my sister who does know better. The question is what you're going to do with that knowledge. Colonel Chen honked the horn gently, indicating that their time was running short. David glanced toward the car, then back at his family. I have to go, he said. There are still 12 operatives in the field waiting for decisions that only I can make. But Jennifer, we're going to have a much longer conversation about this soon. In the meantime, I suggest you think carefully about what kind of officer you want to be going for. As David walked back toward the sedan, Jennifer called out after him. Dave, General Wilson, will you ever forgive me? David paused at the car door, looking back at his sister with an expression that was somehow both disappointed and hopeful. Jennifer, he said quietly, forgiveness isn't the question. The question is whether you've learned anything from this experience that will make you a better officer and a better person. The sedan pulled away, leaving Jennifer alone with Uncle Robert, Tommy, and the wreckage of everything she thought she knew about herself and her family. The silence that followed David's departure was deafening. Jennifer sat motionless on her front porch, staring at the empty driveway where the black sedan had been just moments before. The evening air felt heavy with the weight of everything that had been said and everything that hadn't been said. Uncle Robert remained in his chair, his weathered hands folded over his walking cane, while Tommy perched on the steps with the uncomfortable posture of someone who had witnessed something far beyond his years. Mom, Tommy said quietly, breaking the silence. "Are you okay?" Jennifer turned to look at her son, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in days. This 16-year-old boy had watched his mother's entire world collapse in the span of. He'd seen her go from confident battalion commander to humiliated failure, from family success story to cautionary tale, and through it all, he'd maintained a maturity and compassion that she was only now beginning to appreciate. "No, Tommy," she said honestly, "I'm not okay. I don't think I've been okay for a long time." Uncle Robert shifted in his chair, his sharp eyes studying his niece with the kind of assessment that came from 7 decades of observing human nature. "Jenny, you want to tell me what you're thinking right now?" Jennifer was quiet for a long moment, trying to sort through the chaos of emotions and realizations that were crashing over her. "I'm thinking that I don't know who I am anymore," she said finally. "For 20 years I built my identity around being a successful military officer. I thought I understood what military values meant, what service looked like, what success in the army required." She gestured weakly toward the empty driveway. "And then I discover that my brother who I've been pitying and lecturing for 2 years, is everything I thought I was, only 1,000 times more. He's the real military success story. He's the one living genuine military values. He's the one making decisions that actually matter." Tommy was listening intently, his teenage face creased with concern. "But Mom, you're still a good officer, right? I mean, what Uncle Dave doesn't change what you've accomplished." Jennifer's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "Tommy, what have I actually accomplished? I commanded a training battalion for 2 years. I processed paperwork, conducted routine exercises, and gave speeches about military values to new recruits. Meanwhile, your uncle was preventing terrorist attacks and saving American lives on 6 continents." "That's not fair to yourself, Jenny," Uncle Robert interjected. "Training the next generation of soldiers is important work. Building military readiness matters. You can't compare every military career to someone operating at Dave's level." "But that's just it, Uncle Robert," Jennifer said, her voice rising with emotion. "I wasn't content with doing important work. I had to feel superior to everyone else. I had to believe that my way was the only right way, that anyone who didn't follow my path was somehow a failure." She stood up and began pacing the small porch, her military bearings still evident, despite her emotional state. "Do you know what the worst part is? It's not that I was wrong about Dave's circumstance. It's that even if I had been right, even if he really had been a struggling veteran working at a hardware store, my behavior would still have been cruel and unmilitary." Tommy watched his mother pace, beginning to understand the depth of her self-recrimination. "So what happens next?" Jennifer stopped pacing and looked at her son with an expression that was equal parts grief and determination. "Now I figure out who I actually am underneath all this military posturing. I figure out what kind of officer I want to be for the rest of my career, assuming I still have one." Her phone buzzed with another text message. This time it was from her longtime friend Captain Lisa Rodriguez, who served at a different base. "Jenny, heard some crazy rumors about you and your brother. Please tell me they're not true." Jennifer showed the message to Uncle Robert, who whistled low. "Word travels fast in military circles. By tomorrow, every officer in the Southeast will have heard some version of this story." "Good," Jennifer said, surprising both Robert and Tommy with her "Maybe public humiliation is exactly what I need. Maybe I need everyone to know what I did so I can't pretend it didn't happen, or minimize it in my own mind." Uncle Robert raised an eyebrow. "That's an interesting perspective. I spent last night humiliating my brother in public because I thought he deserved it," Jennifer said. "Maybe now it's my turn to face the consequences of that behavior publicly. Maybe that's how justice works." Tommy stood up from the steps, his teenage awkwardness evident, as he struggled with how to respond to his mother's emotional crisis. "Mom, I'm proud of you." Jennifer looked at her son in surprise. "Proud of me? Tommy, I just destroyed my military career and publicly humiliated your uncle. How can you be proud of me?" "Because you're taking responsibility," Tommy said simply. "Because you're not making excuses or blaming other people. Because you're trying to figure out how to be better." The words hit Jennifer harder than any punishment her commanding officers could have devised. Her 16-year-old son had identified something that she was only beginning to understand herself. that taking genuine responsibility for her actions was the first step toward rebuilding her character. "Your boy's got wisdom beyond his years," Uncle Robert observed. "Maybe you should listen to him." Jennifer sat back down, feeling emotionally drained, but somehow clearer than she'd felt in years. "Uncle Robert, can I ask you something?" "Shoot. When you came back from Vietnam, how did you handle the transition? How did you figure out who you were supposed to be as a civilian?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with memories that Jennifer could only imagine. "Jenny, I'm not sure I ever did figure it out completely, but I learned that military service changes you in ways you don't always understand at the time. The trick is figuring out which changes made you better, and which ones made you worse." "What do you mean?" "I mean the military teaches you discipline, honor, sacrifice, teamwork, all good things, but it can also teach you arrogance, inflexibility, and the belief that your way is the only right way. The challenge is keeping the good parts and letting go of the bad parts." Jennifer nodded slowly, beginning to understand. "I think I kept some of the wrong parts." "We all do," Robert said. "The question is what you're going to do about it now." As if summoned by their conversation, Miguel appeared at the front door, his face etched with concern and confusion. "Jennifer, how are you holding up?" She looked at her husband, this good man who had supported her military career for 15 years, who had moved whenever the army required it, who had raised their son while she deployed and trained and climbed the ranks. How much of her arrogance and superiority had he endured over the years? "Miguel," she said quietly, "I need to apologize to you too, for a lot of things." Miguel sat down beside his wife, taking her hand in his. "We'll figure it out together," he said simply. "That's what families do." As the evening shadows lengthened across their front porch, Jennifer Wilson Martinez began the long process of figuring out who she really was beneath the uniform and the rank, and the military identity that had defined her for so long. It would be painful work, but for the first time in years, it felt like the right kind of work to be doing. The reckoning with herself had only just begun. 3 days after the confrontation, the story of Captain Jennifer Wilson Martinez and her 3-star general brother had spread through the military community like wildfire. What had started as gossip at Fort Stewart had reached bases across the Southeast, then jumped to social media, military forums, and eventually mainstream news outlets. The story was too perfect, too filled with dramatic irony and moral lessons, to remain contained within military circles. Jennifer sat in her new office, a cramped supply depot cubicle that was barely large enough for a desk and filing cabinet, staring at her computer screen in horror. Someone had leaked the security camera footage from the family barbecue, and now her public humiliation of David was playing on repeat across the internet. The video had been edited to highlight her most cruel moments, with captions identifying her as an army captain and David as a 3-star general. "Captain lectures 3-star general brother about military failure," read the headline on Military Times. The article had been shared over 10,000 times in just 12 hours. "When stolen valor goes wrong, sister attacks general," proclaimed another headline, completely misunderstanding the situation, but generating massive engagement nonetheless. Her phone had been ringing constantly with requests for interviews, comments from reporters, and messages from fellow officers expressing everything from sympathy to schadenfreude. Jennifer had stopped answering calls from unknown numbers, but the voicemails kept piling up. "Captain Wilson Martinez, this is Rebecca Chen, from CNN. We'd love to get your perspective on the viral video showing your confrontation with General Wilson." "Jennifer, this is Colonel Mike Rodriguez from the War College. We're doing a case study on leadership failures and family dynamics in military families." "Ma'am, this is Sergeant Martinez from the base public affairs office. We need to discuss your media strategy going forward." Jennifer deleted the messages without listening to them completely. There was no media strategy that could fix this situation, no public relations approach that could undo the damage to her reputation and career. A knock on her cubicle wall made her look up. Captain Lisa Rodriguez, her longtime friend from their days at Fort Benning, stood in the doorway with a concerned expression and 2 cups of coffee. "Heard you might need one of these," Lisa said, setting a cup on Jennifer's desk. "Lisa," Jennifer said weakly, "what are you doing here?" "Drove down from Bragg this morning,"
Lisa replied, settling into the only other chair in the cramped space. Figured you could use a friend right about now. Jennifer felt tears building in her eyes. Most of her military colleagues had been avoiding her since the story broke, either from embarrassment, professional caution, or simple schadenfreude. Having someone show up with coffee and genuine concern felt like a lifeline. Have you seen the video? Jennifer asked quietly. Lisa nodded grimly. Everyone's seen the video, Jen. It's everywhere. Military blogs, social media, cable news shows. You've become a case study in how not to handle family dynamics. I know, Jennifer said, burying her face in her hand. I wake up every morning hoping it was all a nightmare, and then I remember that millions of people have now watched me publicly humiliate my brother, the brother who turns out to be one of the most powerful people in the Defense Department. Lisa added, Jen, how did you not know? How does someone not know their own brother is a 3-star general? Jennifer explained the cover story, the carefully maintained facade, the operational security requirements that had kept David's true identity hidden for 2 years. Lisa listened with growing amazement, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. So let me get this straight, Lisa said when Jennifer finished. While you were commanding a training battalion and feeling superior about your military success, your brother was running intelligence operations on 6 continents, and controlling budgets larger than most countries' defense spending. That's about the size of it, Jennifer confirmed. And you spent 2 years lecturing him about military values and personal responsibility. At every family gathering, Lisa was quiet for a long moment, processing the magnitude of the situation. Jen, this is going to follow you for the rest of your career. Every assignment, every evaluation, every interaction with fellow officers, they're all going to know you as the captain who publicly humiliated a 3-star general. I know, Jennifer said. My new commanding officer made that very clear. I'm basically radioactive from a career perspective. No one wants to work with someone who shows such poor judgment about family members, let alone senior officers. Her computer chimed with another email notification. This one was from the base chaplain, offering counseling services for officers dealing with public embarrassment and career setbacks. Even the chaplain had heard about her situation. What's the latest from your family? Lisa asked. Tommy's been getting questions at school. Kids asking if his mom is the lady from the viral video. Miguel's coworkers keep bringing it up. Uncle Robert says he's proud of me for taking responsibility, but I can tell he's embarrassed by the whole situation. And your brother? Jennifer was quiet for a moment. He's been traveling. Some kind of crisis in Eastern Europe that requires his personal attention. We haven't spoken since that night on the porch. Lisa leaned forward in her chair. Jen, can I ask you something? Sure. What's your plan here? Because right now you're in full damage control mode, but I don't see any actual plan for moving forward. Jennifer looked around her tiny cubicle, with its bare walls and single window that faced the parking lot. Honestly, I'm just trying to survive each day. Figure out who I am when I'm not the successful battalion commander anymore. That's not enough, Lisa said, firmly. You need to decide what kind of officer you want to be for the rest of your career, because like it or not, you still have a career. It might not be the career you planned, but it's still a career. Before Jennifer could respond, her cubicle phone rang. The caller ID showed a Pentagon number that she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she answered. Captain Wilson Martinez speaking. Captain, this is Colonel Sarah Mitchell from the Defense Intelligence Agency. I'm calling on behalf of General Wilson. He'd like to schedule a meeting with you regarding your current situation and potential future assignments. Jennifer's heart stopped. David was reaching out, but through official channels. This wasn't a family conversation. This was a military consultation. Ma'am, when would the general like to meet? Tomorrow, 1400 hours, at his office in McLean. A driver will pick you up at Fort Stewart at 1000. Please bring your personnel file and be prepared to discuss your career goals going forward. The line went dead, leaving Jennifer staring at the phone in her hand. Who was that? Lisa asked. My brother, Jennifer said quietly. He wants to meet at his office with my personnel file. Lisa's eyebrows rose. Official meeting. Very official. Jen, Lisa said carefully, When a 3-star general calls you to his office to discuss your career goals, that's not a family conversation, that's something else entirely. Jennifer nodded, understanding exactly what her friend meant. Tomorrow, she wouldn't be meeting with Dave, her disappointed brother. She'd be meeting with General Wilson, Deputy Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, and whatever he had planned would determine the rest of her military career. The reckoning was far from over.
The Defense Intelligence Agency headquarters in McLean, Virginia was unlike any military facility Jennifer had ever entered. The building's sleek modern architecture and sophisticated security systems spoke to budgets and purposes that existed far above her previous level of military experience. As she was escorted through corridors lined with classified briefing rooms and secure communication centers, Jennifer began to understand the true scope of the world her brother operated in. Her escort, a young lieutenant colonel with multiple deployment ribbons and the bearing of someone who'd seen serious combat, maintained professional silence as they navigated through security checkpoints that scanned everything from her fingerprints to her retinal patterns. This wasn't the casual base security she was accustomed to. This was the kind of facility where mistakes could compromise national security. Captain Wilson Martinez, the lieutenant colonel said as they approached a door marked only with David's name and rank. The general will see you now. Please leave your phone and any recording devices with the security officer. Jennifer handed over her phone to a serious-faced sergeant who sealed it in what appeared to be a signal-blocking container. Whatever conversation was about to take place would remain completely confidential. The door opened to reveal an office that took Jennifer's breath away. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Virginia countryside, while the walls displayed maps showing global military operations, classified briefing charts and photographs of David with world leaders Jennifer recognized from news broadcasts. Behind an imposing mahogany desk sat her brother, wearing his dress uniform with its array of ribbons and decorations that she was only now beginning to understand. But he wasn't alone. 3 other officers sat in chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the desk. Jennifer recognized the rank insignia of 2 colonels and a brigadier general, all wearing expressions of professional assessment that made her stomach tighten with anxiety. Captain Wilson Martinez, David said formally, rising from his chair with the kind of military precision that left no doubt about his authority in this room. Please, have a seat. Jennifer took the remaining chair, her personnel file clutched in her hands as she tried to process what kind of meeting this actually was. The formal atmosphere, the presence of other senior officers, the secure facility, this felt more like a military tribunal than a family conversation. Captain, David continued, I'd like you to meet Colonel Sarah Mitchell from Personnel Assessment, Colonel James Parker from the Defense Intelligence School, and Brigadier General Patricia Hayes from Special Operations Command. Each officer nodded as they were introduced, their expressions professionally neutral but clearly assessing. Jennifer realized with growing unease that this wasn't just a meeting, it was an evaluation. General Wilson, Jennifer said carefully, may I ask the purpose of this meeting? David opened a file on his desk that she recognized as a copy of her military personnel record. Captain, over the past week, your situation has raised questions about judgment, discretion, and suitability for continued military service. However, it has also demonstrated certain qualities that may be valuable in different contexts. Colonel Mitchell leaned forward slightly. Captain Wilson Martinez, your public confrontation with General Wilson, while deeply inappropriate, showed a willingness to speak directly to authority figures without fear of consequences. In certain military specialties, that kind of directness can be an asset if properly channeled. Jennifer blinked in confusion. Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. Brigadier General Hayes spoke next, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. Captain, traditional military careers are built on hierarchy, protocol, and working within established systems, but some positions require officers who can operate outside those systems when necessary. What the general is saying, Colonel Parker added, is that your current situation, while professionally damaging in conventional terms, might actually qualify you for assignments that require a different skill set. David leaned back in his chair, studying his sister with the same analytical expression she'd seen him use when assessing complex situations. Jennifer, what do you know about military intelligence operations that require deep cover? Deep cover, Jennifer repeated, her mind struggling to process where this conversation was heading. Officers who must assume false identities for extended periods, David explained, who must maintain fictional backgrounds, relationships, and careers while gathering intelligence or protecting assets. Officers who must be convincing in their cover roles even to family members. The implications hit Jennifer like a physical blow. You're talking about spy work. We prefer the term intelligence operations, Colonel Mitchell said with a slight smile. But yes, Cap, we're discussing the possibility of training you for assignments that require extended deep cover operations. Jennifer looked around the room at the faces of these senior officers, trying to understand what was being offered. Why would you consider me for something like, I've just demonstrated catastrophic failure of judgment and professional behavior? Actually, Brigadier General Hayes said, you've demonstrated the ability to maintain a genuine emotional and professional response to what you believed was a family member's failure. Your reaction, while inappropriate, was completely authentic. In deep cover operations, that kind of authentic emotional response is invaluable. David stood up and moved to the window overlooking the Virginia countryside. Jennifer, most officers who attempt deep cover operations struggle with maintaining their false identities when interacting with people they care about. They slip into their real personalities, use knowledge they shouldn't have, or fail to maintain the emotional authenticity their cover requires. You, on the other hand, Colonel Parker continued, spent 2 years treating a 3-star general like a failed relative because you completely believed in his cover identity. That level of commitment to treating someone according to their apparent circumstances, rather than their actual status, is exactly what deep cover operations require. Jennifer's mind was reeling. You're saying my complete failure to recognize my brother's real identity is somehow a qualification for intelligence work? We're saying, David replied, turning back to face her, that your ability to respond authentically to cover identity, combined with your demonstrated willingness to confront people regardless of potential consequences, might make you suitable for operations that require officers who can blend into civilian environments while maintaining military objectives. Colonel Mitchell opened another file. Captain, the training program would be 18 months of intensive instruction in cover identity development, intelligence gathering, operational security, and deep cover maintenance. Upon completion, you would be assigned to operations requiring long-term civilian cover. What kind of operations? Jennifer asked. The kind we can't discuss in detail until you've completed security clearance upgrades and signed additional non-disclosure agreements, Brigadier General Hayes replied. But I can tell you that such operations often involve protecting high-value assets, gathering intelligence on threats to national security, and maintaining cover identities for years at a time. Jennifer looked at her brother, finally understanding what was being offered. This isn't just about finding me a new assignment, is it? This is about turning my spectacular failure into a different kind of military career. David nodded slowly. Jennifer, conventional military leadership clearly isn't your strength, but unconventional operations might. The question is whether you're willing to rebuild your military identity from the ground up. And if I'm not, she asked, then you continue your current assignment until your 20-year retirement, Colonel Parker said, pushing papers in supply depots until you can collect your pension. Jennifer stared at the faces around her, understanding that she was being offered a choice between professional purgatory and professional transformation. Her old military career was over, but a completely different kind of service was being offered in its place. How long do I have to decide? She asked. 72 hours, David replied. After that, the offer disappears and your current assignment becomes permanent. As Jennifer was escorted out of the building, her mind churned with possibilities she'd never imagined. Her brother hadn't just forgiven her, he'd found a way to transform her greatest failure into a potential new beginning. But it would require giving up everything she thought she knew about military service and starting over in a world where nothing was quite what it seemed. Jennifer sat on her front porch the next evening, watching the sunset paint the Georgia sky in shades of orange and purple. The 72-hour deadline for her decision was rapidly approaching, and she still felt no closer to an answer than when she'd left the Pentagon facility the day before. The choice between professional purgatory and professional transformation seemed impossible to make. Uncle Robert was in his usual chair, quietly working on a wooden puzzle that had been occupying his attention for the better part of a week. Tommy sat on the porch steps, ostensibly doing homework but clearly listening to every word of the adult conversation. Miguel had taken the evening shift at his contracting job, leaving the family to process the magnitude of what David had offered. "Uncle Robert," Jennifer said quietly, "what would you do?" The old Vietnam veteran looked up from his puzzle, his weathered hands pausing in their careful work. "Jenny, that's not really my decision to make, but I can tell you what I think the real question is." "What do you mean?" "I mean, the choice isn't really between staying in Supply Depot or becoming a spy," Robert said. "The choice is between accepting who you've been or becoming who you might be." Tommy looked up from his homework. "Mom, what's deep cover like? I mean, would you have to pretend to be someone else for years?" Jennifer had been thinking about exactly that question. "According to the briefing materials they gave me, I'd assume a completely fictional identity. New name, new background, new career. I'd have to maintain that identity even with people I became close to, like Uncle Dave did with us," Tommy said with surprising insight. "Exactly like Uncle Dave did with us," Jennifer confirmed. "For years, possibly decades, I'd have to live as someone else entirely, and the people around me, friends, co-workers, maybe even a fake husband someday, would never know my real identity." Uncle Robert resumed working on his puzzle. "Sounds lonely." "It does," Jennifer agreed, "but it also sounds like a chance to be useful again, to serve my country in a way that actually matters." Her phone buzzed with a text message from Lisa Rodriguez. "Jen, whatever you decide, make sure it's for the right reasons. Don't run away from your mistakes. Use them to become better." The wisdom in those words hit Jennifer harder than she'd expected. Was she considering David's offer because it represented genuine redemption, or simply because it offered an escape from the consequences of her actions? "Can I ask you something, Uncle Robert?" "Do you think Dave forgives me? Really forgives me? Not just professionally tolerates me?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, considering his answer carefully. "Jenny, your brother spent 2 years enduring your lectures and criticism without ever breaking character. Not once did he slip up and reveal his true position, even when you were being especially cruel. What does that tell you?" "It tells me that Dave understands sacrifice in ways most people never will. He sacrificed his relationship with his family to protect operations that save lives. He let you think he was a failure to keep his cover intact." Tommy had put down his homework entirely, fascinated by his great-uncle's perspective. "So Uncle Dave was protecting people the whole time Mom was being mean to him." "That's right, Tommy," Roberts. "And now he's offering your mother a chance to make that same kind of sacrifice, to give up her old identity and serve her country in a way that requires the same kind of personal cost he's been paying." Jennifer felt a chill run down her spine. She'd been thinking about David's offer in terms of career redemption, but Uncle Robert was right. This was about sacrifice, not advancement. Deep cover operations weren't glamorous spy work. They were years of isolation, deception, and loneliness in service of something larger than herself. "The question," Robert continued, "is whether you're ready to pay that price. Because once you start down that path, there's no going back to the old Jennifer. That woman, the battalion commander who thought she knew everything about military service, she'd have to disappear forever." Tommy was staring at his mother with wide eyes. "Mom, would we still be able to see you?" Jennifer's heart clenched. "I don't know, Tommy. The briefing materials talked about limited contact with family members and operational security requirements. It might be years between visits." "But you'd be doing important work," Tommy said quietly. "Like Uncle Dave." "Yes," Jennifer confirmed, "like Uncle Dave." Her phone rang, interrupting the family conversation. The caller ID showed David's personal number, not his Pentagon line. Jennifer answered hesitantly. "Hi, Dave." "Hi, Jennifer. How are you holding up?" The casual tone in his voice was so different from the formal authority he'd displayed in his Pentagon office that Jennifer almost started crying. This was her brother again, not General Wilson. "I'm confused," she said honestly, "and scared and grateful, all at the same time." "That's a reasonable response," David said with what sounded like a smile in his voice. "Can I ask what you're leaning toward?" Jennifer looked at Uncle Robert and Tommy, both of whom were listening intently to her side of the conversation. "Dave, Can I ask you something first? Sure. Do you really think I'd be good at this kind of work? Or are you just trying to find a way to save my career? David was quiet for a moment. Jennifer, if I were just trying to save your career, I'd have made some phone calls and gotten you transferred to a different base with a clean slate. The intelligence community doesn't offer deep cover positions as career counseling. Then why? Because you demonstrated something at that barbecue that most people can't do, David said. You maintained a completely authentic emotional response to a cover identity for 2 years. You never suspected, never questioned, never saw through the facade. That's not a character flaw, Jennifer. That's a rare skill. Uncle Robert was nodding approvingly as he listened to Jennifer's side of the conversation. But more importantly, David continued, you've learned something about yourself over the past week that makes you suitable for this kind of work. You've learned humility. You've learned that your assumptions about people can be completely wrong. You've learned that service sometimes requires personal sacrifice. And you think that makes me qualified to be a spy. I think it makes you qualified to be someone who can disappear into a cover identity and serve her country without needing recognition or advancement, or public appreciation, David said. Someone who can accept that the most important work often goes completely unnoticed. Jennifer felt tears building in her eyes. Dave, I'm sorry, for everything, for not understanding who you really were, for the things I said, for the public humiliation. Jennifer, David interrupted gently, you don't need to apologize anymore. What you need to do is decide who you want to be going forward. After they hung up, Jennifer sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything that had been said. Uncle Robert had returned to his puzzle, but Tommy was still watching her with concern and curiosity. Mom, Tommy said quietly, whatever you decide, I'm proud of you. Why? Because you're trying to figure out how to do the right thing, even when it's really hard. Jennifer looked at her son, this wise, compassionate teenager who had watched his mother's world collapse and was still offering support and understanding. Maybe that was the real measure of success, not rank or recognition, but raising a child who could show grace under pressure. Tommy, she said, how would you feel if your mom became a spy? Tommy grinned. I'd tell everyone at school that my mom and my uncle are the coolest people in America. Jennifer laughed for the first time in a week. Even if you couldn't see me very often. Mom, Tommy said seriously, if you and Uncle Dave are keeping people safe, then not seeing you very often would be worth it. As the sun finished setting over the Georgia countryside, Jennifer Wilson Martinez finally knew what her answer would be. 1 year later, Colonel Marcus Chen walked through the secure corridors of the Defense Intelligence Agency, carrying a classified file that had become something of a legend within the intelligence community. The file was marked Operation Silent Sister, and contained the performance records of one of their most successful deep cover operatives. He knocked on General David Wilson's office door and entered to find his commanding officer reviewing global intelligence summaries with the same quiet intensity that had made him one of the most respected officers in American military history. Sir, Chen said, setting the file on David's desk, the annual assessment on Agent Sierra 7. David looked up from his briefings, a slight smile crossing his face. How's she doing? Remarkable, sir, Chen replied, opening the file. In 12 months of deep cover, she's successfully infiltrated a defense contractor suspected of selling technology to hostile nations, identified 3 security breaches that could have compromised classified programs, and prevented what we believe would have been a major intelligence coup by foreign operative. David leaned back in his chair. And her cover identity? Absolutely solid. Jennifer Martinez, that's her cover name, is known to her coworkers as a dedicated project manager who works long hours and keeps to herself. She's respected but not remarkable, trusted but not suspicious. Perfect deep cover maintenance. Any issues with emotional authenticity? Chen shook his head. None, sir. In fact, her ability to maintain genuine relationships while protecting her true identity has exceeded all expectations. She's built friendships, professional relationships, even a romantic interest, all while gathering critical intelligence. Her case officer reports that she never breaks character, never slips into her old personality. David nodded, remembering the conversation that had led to this moment. His sister had chosen transformation over comfort, service over safety, humility over pride. Sir, Chen continued,
There's something else. She's been recommended for the Distinguished Service Medal for her work on the defense contractor operation. The intelligence she gathered prevented the loss of technology worth approximately $2 billion and potentially saved American lives. A medal she'll never be able to publicly receive, David observed. No, it'll go in her classified file and maybe her family will be told she received a commendation for administrative excellence, or something equally mundane. David was quiet for a moment, thinking about the irony of the situation. Jennifer had spent years craving recognition, advancement, and public acknowledgement of her military achievements. Now she was performing the most important work of her career, and no one could ever know about it. How's her family handling the separation? David asked. According to the quarterly family welfare reports, they're managing well, Chen replied. Her son Tommy just started his senior year of high school. He tells people his mom works for a boring government contractor in Washington. Her husband Miguel has adapted to the cover story about her frequent business travel. They see her approximately every 6 weeks for brief visits. And Uncle Robert? Chen smiled. The old veteran figured out what was really happening within about 3 months. He hasn't said anything directly, but according to surveillance reports, he's been telling people at the VFW that his niece is finally doing the kind of military work that matters. David laughed quietly. Robert had always been perceptive about military matters. Sir, Chen said carefully, there's one more thing. Agent Sierra 7 has submitted a request to extend her current assignment indefinitely. She's asking to remain in deep cover rather than rotate back to conventional military service. This surprised Dave. Deep cover operations were psychologically demanding, emotionally isolating, and professionally thankless. Most operatives couldn't wait to return to normal military life. Did she provide a reason? Yes, she said, and I quote, "For the first time in my military career, I understand what it means to serve something larger than myself. I'd like to continue this work as long as I'm useful." David stared out the window at the Virginia countryside, remembering the arrogant captain who had publicly humiliated him at a family barbecue just over a year ago. That woman had been so focused on rank, recognition, and personal advancement that she'd lost sight of what military service really meant. The woman working under deep cover now understood something that had taken David years to learn, that the most important work often goes unrecognized, and that true service requires personal sacrifice without public reward. Approve her request, David said quietly, and make sure her family receives the best possible support. After Chen left, David opened his desk drawer and pulled out a photograph from the family barbecue where everything had changed. In it, Jennifer was mid-lecture, her finger pointed accusingly while she explained military values to someone she thought was a failure. The irony was almost painful to observe. His secure phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a Pentagon number he recognized immediately. General Wilson. David, this is Secretary Morrison. I wanted to personally thank you for the intelligence package your team provided on the Eastern European situation. Your operatives prevented what could have been a catastrophic security breach. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My team performed exceptionally. I'm particularly impressed with the work of one of your deep cover assets, Agent Sierra 7, I believe. Her intelligence was instrumental in resolving the situation. David smiled. Sierra 7 is one of our most dedicated operatives. Well, please pass along my appreciation. That kind of selfless service is what makes America strong. After hanging up, David reflected on the journey that had brought his family to this point. Jennifer's public humiliation had become private redemption. Her cruelest moment had led to her most meaningful service. Her greatest failure had transformed into her greatest success. But the real lesson wasn't about career transformation or personal redemption. It was about the nature of true service itself. For 20 years, Jennifer had measured military success by rank, recognition, and public acknowledgement. She'd believed that leadership meant being seen, heard, and respected. She'd thought that military values were about commanding others and demonstrating superiority. Now she understood what David had always known, that the most important military service often happens in shadows, that real leadership sometimes means disappearing entirely, and that true military values require sacrifice without recognition. The barbecue incident had taught the entire Wilson family something profound about judging others by appearances, but more importantly, It had taught them about the difference between serving for personal glory and serving for something greater than themselves. As David returned to his intelligence briefings, he thought about all the families across America who might be making the same mistakes Jennifer had made, judging veterans by their apparent circumstances, rather than understanding the full scope of their service. How many unsuccessful veterans were actually serving in ways their families couldn't imagine? How many quiet heroes were being dismissed by people who measured success only by what they could see and understand? The viral video of Jennifer's cruel lecture had become a teaching tool at military academies and leadership schools across the country, not because it showed what not to do, but because it demonstrated how easy it is to misjudge people when you don't understand their true circumstance. The real moral of the story wasn't about Jennifer's redemption or David's forgiveness, it was about the invisible nature of genuine service and the danger of judging others without understanding their full story. In a world that celebrates visible success and public recognition, the Wilson family had learned that the most important work often goes unseen, the greatest sacrifices often go unacknowledged, and the truest service often requires the courage to disappear entirely. Jennifer Wilson Martinez, now Agent Sierra 7, had finally learned what it meant to serve with genuine humility, and in learning that lesson, she had become the kind of person her brother had always known she could be. The family that had been fractured by judgment and pride had been healed by understanding and service, and somewhere in Washington, a dedicated intelligence operative continued her quiet work of protecting a nation that would never know her name. That, David reflected, was what real military values looked like.
You've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.